Is there, for lack of a better term, a compassion gap in our society today? As you probably know, Time magazine today, they announced their Person of the Year, and it was the Pontiff, Pope Francis. As his papacy continues to be celebrated and his popularity soaring here, especially among Americans. But in our morning editorial meeting, Andrew made a few points about the messages the Pope has been advocating and how they seem to be falling, at least on certain parts of this country, on deaf ears. And Andrew, you made the point that it has to do a lot with, believe it or not, what we hear in Washington, what he's selling, some folks aren't necessarily buying.
Well, and I want to stay with what the Pope has been talking about, Rich. This is a Pope already known for his openness and his tolerance and his understanding. He's taken on some of the church's sacred cows like abortion, gays and gay rights, and also the gap between rich and poor, not just the economics, but our approaches and our mindsets. In his apostolic exhortation in November, the Pontiff wrote, "The Pope loves everyone, rich and poor alike. He is obliged in the name of Christ to remind all that the rich must help, respect, and promote the poor." That message, in my mind, as I've been reading the Times Moving series about the inviolable child, about the growing difficulties for one young city girl named Dasani, whose family has been squeaking by in the margins, invisible child, excuse me. The series painfully describing living conditions, rats and mold and no electricity in their cramped city-run homeless shelter, financial struggles, educational challenges, the troubles the girl has getting along with her peers, and all with parents going through troubles of their own. It really is a moving read, and we recommend it highly. But then I picked up a copy of the New York Post, and I read their editorial Monday, quote, "The Times homeless hooey," and a rather heartless message from the Post's editorial board, saying that the family in the Times piece, they're not really homeless at all. Their 540 square foot unit gives them a solid roof over their heads, in addition to city-provided meals and services. Post noting that the family's housing has problems, including mice and reports of sexual assaults and other crimes, but still insisting that the Times, like much of the liberal establishment that they wrote, seem to think it's the city's job to provide comfortable lives to outrageously irresponsible parents, in this case, a couple with a long history of drug problems and difficulty holding jobs, saying something's wrong with that picture. And then the clincher, quote, "If the city is at fault here, it might well be for having been too generous." You know, we're hearing a lot of talk about being too generous lately. New budget deal in the news out of Washington doesn't include long-term unemployment extensions for more than 1 million people. Why? They're too generous.
I do support unemployment benefits for the 26 weeks that they're paid for. If you extend it beyond that, you do a disservice to these workers.
Or too much generosity in food stamps, which House Republicans want to slash, freeloaders they're called, gaming the system, or in a livable minimum wage, which millions are asking for. All of these, Rich, have economic arguments as well. I think Rich Brodsky and I would argue an economic benefit to the country if you passed all these programs, but there's, from a compassion standpoint, there's a long way difference between Pope Benedict and what we're hearing from so many on the right when it comes to helping each other.
You know, Dom, when you get into the policy debates and some suit in Washington says something, sometimes it feels like white noise. But if anyone's read anything in that series that the Times been doing on Dasani and her life and what she has to go through, for somebody to think, get in front of their laptop, and then type out that if anything, the city's faulted for being too generous when you hear what that kid's got to go through. This isn't about bleeding heart. Forget about a conscience, who's with a pulse thinks that that kid's having it too good? And you know what? It's not just the editorial page. A lot of people think, especially in bad economic times, people that might not have cared either way, they're blaming this population as the problem with what's going on, and not, you know, that they're on the bottom end and maybe you put a hand down to pull them up. When Andrew made the connection with the Person of the Year and what the Post said about that series, and the third part was today. If you go online, you can see the fourth and fifth part, and at the end of it, you see this mosaic of so many people living a life like this kid and the family. I just don't get, forget about where they're coming from, I just don't get how people think this.
Well, it's real simple. And as the only African American at the table, you guys are going to go, there goes Dominic with the race argument. But what the Post is doing is playing to the worst despicable element of their readership, of some of their readership. What they're really saying is, we're tired of throwing good money after bad on these black and Latino families. That's what they're really saying in their editorial. maybe there's a little bit of justification. I don't know, but it's despicable what they're doing. So is this no longer America? In fairness, I've been reading this. I didn't read the Times story. I looked at it, and let me tell you why I didn't read it, Richard. I could tell you the exact story looking at the headline. I've been reading that same story for 30 years, and I'm tired of reading it. Poor black family, homeless shelter. Normally the shelter was on 42nd Street. The city's paying $3,000 a month rent. There's sexual abuse. There's fraud. There's all types of horrible things. I've been listening to that story for 30 years now. But come on, this is America. We have to help people.
But you know what? You're right, but if you read the story, you'll walk away unbelievably impressed by this kid. And you feel when you read it, we should do everything. And apparently the readership has been flooding in with donations to the better side of
And that's
Angels.
a good thing.
It is a good thing.
That's a good thing.
But for me, Obi, forget about the right and the wrong. It's just the stupidest thing we could do to say, you know what, cut off, because the mom or dad's an idiot, let's cut off the kid.
Well, there's
And
a
that's
number of
in
things.
effect that we're
There's
too generous to this
You can't
kid?
look at one specific example and say this is symbolic of the whole entire thing. You have to look at the whole picture and say we've got a housing problem in New York City. We all admit it. Look at the hundreds of millions of dollars of backlogs of repairs in public housing right now. And if this family, forget the drugs for a second, but if this family was trying to just go on that waiting list, the child would be out of college before they could
But I want
get
to
in
ask
the
you a
homes.
broader picture.
Dominic,
No, I
we
wanna let you
talked about
answer.
these
Wait,
before, though.
I want to answer
But
broad.
so
So the bigger question that not everyone agrees with, Rand Paul wouldn't agree with it. Are we our brother's keeper? Do we have a
not
responsibility?
the question.
It is the question.
It is not a question of charity. It is not a question
it's
of
not
generosity.
charity.
It is a question about the way in which an economic system functions so people can't get themselves out of these situations. It's a history of 30 years
Time out,
of
Richard.
looking at
Time out.
tax.
That might be your
I'm
question.
not finished
no,
yet.
but I'm not done. My point is this. You might be right, the people who want to strike, but I'm taking the worst example. Say the parents are the worst thing going.
It's about
then you take the child
Time
out of
out.
the parents'
It's
care and you
a-
put them in foster
it's
care
about
and do other
power
things.
and wealth, Richard. It is not about morality alone. The Pope, you underestimate this Pope. If you look at him as a guy who's saying we need to be more generous, he's
So the
saying
Catholic guy.
we have to be more just. And there's a big difference between the two. And the reason why this is incomprehensible to you is because you're not prepared to look at the opposition and see them for what they are. People of enormous wealth who want to keep their money
you know
and their
what?
power.
No, you know what?
Actually, I'll go the other way. When I did this, and I was in the project of Atlantic City working with Steve Wynn, we went out to get people jobs and bring them back into jobs that pay well with benefits, with chance for advancement. You know what they called that whole system in there? The social welfare industry. There is an industry of men and women that have the attitude of let's take care of everybody we can and make sure we keep getting our dollars every year and make sure there's some
but you
people
know-
we can do this. And that is exactly what
words,
happens in this system.
in other words, it's
what
a
you
corrupt
need to do,
system.
There's a broken system.
It's not
Corruption sounds
broken
illegal.
if
It's
you-
broken.
it's-
If you live in public housing today, and I heard this all during New York City when I traveled the city
You
with Joe
just
Lota.
said don't
When-
do anecdotes, and now you do anecdotes to prove
No.
your bias.
What I'm saying is this, guys, when you live in public housing, you call and complain about problems right now, men in suits show up instead of men with wrenches. That's the story we kept on
You know
hearing.
what, though? It's
And
such
if
a-
that was
Go
fixed,
ahead, Andrew.
Isn't the larger system broken also? I mean, you keep railing about how the government system, the public sector systems are all broken, but clearly the private sector systems are broken too because it's ended up with this perpetual
People
underclass,
are
with
working
this.
full time and living in homeless shelters. People cannot afford to buy the products they make. The wages that are being paid are insufficient to support human life. That's why we're in this situation, not because there are rats in a homeless shelter. Until you deal with that, you're going to be forced back to look at this as a function of charity instead of a function of justice.
Can I just say this
Knock-
one
go
point?
ahead, go ahead. Knock
Just
him
this
dead.
one point. We have an obligation. We are our brother's keeper, and we have an obligation to look out for others. But on the flip side, I do ask this question. For 30 years, I've been listening to this. Why is it that we pay $3,000 a month to a slumlord for a family to live? It's temporary housing, and this has been going on for 30, 40 years.
that's an abomination.
What-
That is
why is that?
unnecessary to that.
In part because not Obi, not to pick on you, but what nobody wants to hear is the private sector doesn't want to build affordable housing. They don't. No, they don't. You're going to make more. I'm going to make more. Andrew's going to make more. Richard and Dominic. If we have a piece of property, we build it, and we can command rents here that are certainly unaffordable. For now, nearly 50% of the New York families living at or below the poverty line, okay? So people are being priced out because, and I'm a capitalist and I believe in it, because they have a better market to appeal and apply to people that can afford higher rents. There's no place they're going to live, but we're getting off track. What I'm getting at is something different. I don't give two you-know-whats. If mom is a lazy fill in the blank and dad's some shiftless something, this 10-year-old kid deserves better. And I've been around a lot of people who I consider good people who at the end of the day conveniently sum this all up by saying, oh, you know what? They got to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. And this is why it's the biggest load of crap. My kids were born on second base, maybe third. Dasani was born in the batter's box with 2 strikes against her. The idea that we so conveniently tell ourselves that all kids have the same shot here is such crap. And if we're honest enough to say, if we care about all the kids, we're going to give them a fair shot. So when people cry about de Blasio, talking about universal pre-K and how can we do that?
Do you think the people who write these editorials are unaware of this?
I think you ascribe an intent to them that sometimes works, but sometimes they really believe it.
A system which has been structured
I
over
don't
the
think it's
last
as deep
30
as
Why,
years.
if it's that bad here,
You
why
don't-
do,
you don't
why
think
do
the
people
editorial board of the
travel?
New York
Fine,
Post
the
understands
Post,
that?
but I'm saying when you go have dinner with people that are decent people, but they really believe, oh, you know what, the whole social safety nets, what does he say? Every time I talk about it, the whole thing's broken.
So
what do we do?
Have dinner
Throw it
with
all
different
out?
people and change the system so that it's more just, not that it's more charitable.
If I can, because I know we're almost out of time, the other irony in all of this is that we started with Pope Francis, and so many of the people who seem so opposed to so many of these social programs or would raise these objections also seem to wrap themselves in the cloak of religion, and that's just another irony that I wanted to throw out there before we wrapped up.
Richard, in the interest of time, you mentioned being born on second base. Well, I wasn't even born in the stadium. I was miles away from the stadium. But you said you don't give a rat's whatever, about mom and pop. It's about the kids. But you have to care about mom and pop, because if you don't, how is it ever going to? If you throw money at the problem and
right.
mom
But
is
when they
still
wanna
getting
penalize
and
mom
mom is
and
getting.
pop, my only
but
point is
Richard,
the
okay,
kids
but
get
if we're going to be honest, and I try not to say, let's cut through the chase. A lot of this has to do with race. Society feels I've had enough of dealing with these black families, and they don't want to spend the money on the black and Latino families.
Are you wearing a seatbelt?
Okay,
because you're
well,
about to-
This is about white people too.
Well, where
It's
are they?
about-
Because I don't see them in the shelters.
You don't?
I don't see them.
Depends on what community you're in.
On Long Island, you may see
and
them.
Hold on a second.
Yeah, I
This
need
is
a
about-
seatbelt right
This is
now.
about white people and black
No,
people.
this is
and
about
I'm not
predominantly
finished.
black and Latino
But in the
people.
city,
And
and
you know that.
That's not who the poll is talking
we
to.
got to lower the volume
That's
because
not who
I
the
got to
poll
go
is
We
break.
need somebody like him working on the problem. Seriously. It'll
Well,
get better.
a lot of good people have worked on it, but until we get over this hurdle that, you know what, that they're gaming the system instead of looking at the growing population. This is something this program is going to spend a lot of time on. I don't care if you're Republican, Democrat, Liberal. The problem's getting worse. The gap
is
between
getting
have
worse.
and have
It is
not
getting worse.
has never been as bad in my lifetime as it is right now. And if people think it'll get better by itself, we're crazy. And I'm not going to go as far as him maybe, but if we don't rectify the situation, forget about ethics, right and wrong, we're going to regret it. Okay?
We're black leaders
pay
in this
people
problem.
enough to
We're
buy a
the
decent
black
life.
leaders.
We are way over. So when we come back, we're going to talk about Andrew's favorite subject, which is legalizing marijuana in New York here. We'll talk about that because a lawmaker says it's time New York join both Colorado and Washington State. We'll ask if that's a good or a bad idea at the table after this.